May 1978. A small package was discovered in a parking area at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The return address appeared to belong to a professor at Northwestern University, but the professor hadn't sent it. The package was eventually brought to Northwestern, where a campus police officer attempted to open it. It exploded. The officer survived with injuries. At the time, there was little reason to believe this crude device represented the beginning of something much larger. But it did. Over the next 17 years, bombs would appear across the United States, at universities, at businesses, in the mail, and even aboard an aircraft. 3 people would eventually be killed. 23 others would be injured. Federal investigators would spend years searching for the person responsible. They didn't know his name. They didn't know where he lived. They didn't know what he looked like. So investigators gave the case a code name: UNABOM, University and Airline Bomber. Eventually, the unknown attacker would become known around the world as the Unabomber. But behind that name was a man whose life seemed completely disconnected from the image investigators were building. His name was Theodore John Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski was born in Chicago in 1942. From an early age, he demonstrated exceptional academic ability. He skipped grades, excelled academically, and at only 16 years old, entered Harvard University. His path seemed extraordinary. Harvard, graduate studies at the University of Michigan, a doctorate in mathematics. Then, in 1967, Kaczynski became an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley. He was only 25, one of the youngest professors in the university's history. But his academic career didn't last. In 1969, Kaczynski unexpectedly resigned. He gradually withdrew from conventional society. Then, in 1971, he moved to a remote area outside Lincoln, Montana. There, he built a small wooden cabin. No electricity. No running water. Few modern conveniences. He grew food, hunted, read, wrote, and increasingly, rejected the technological society developing around him. Kaczynski believed modern industrial civilization was destroying human freedom. He argued that technology wasn't simply changing society, but controlling it. Roads expanded into wilderness. Development transformed areas around him. Modern machinery reached places he had hoped would remain isolated. His resentment grew. Then, in 1978, the bombs began. Early devices were relatively crude. They were constructed from materials intended to make tracing their origin difficult. The exact construction details are not important to understanding the case. What mattered to investigators was that the devices appeared to evolve over time. The bomber was learning. In 1979, a device was placed aboard American Airlines Flight 444. The device malfunctioned, but smoke filled part of the aircraft, forcing the pilots to make an emergency landing. Attacking an aircraft brought federal authorities even deeper into the investigation. The FBI, the Postal Inspection Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms became involved. Investigators examined fragments. They studied mailing locations. They analyzed handwriting. They searched for fingerprints. They tried to understand the bomber's targets. Universities appeared repeatedly. Scientists, researchers, people connected to technology. But the pattern wasn't simple enough to reveal who the bomber was. In 1985, the campaign became deadly. Hugh Scruton, a computer store owner in Sacramento, California, became the first person killed by one of Kaczynski's bombs. What had begun with injuries had escalated to murder. Investigators intensified their search, but they were confronting an offender who appeared to live almost completely outside the systems they normally relied upon. No credit card trail connected him to the crimes. No obvious employment pattern explained the targets. No digital footprint revealed his location. No known criminal identity gave investigators a name. Years passed. The bombs continued. Then, in 1987, investigators finally received something they desperately needed. A witness had seen a suspicious man near the location of one of the devices. Working with investigators, a description was developed. A hooded man, with dark glasses, The resulting composite sketch would become one of the most recognizable images in American criminal history. But a sketch wasn't a name. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, Ted Kaczynski remained hidden. Investigators had no idea that the person they were searching for was living inside a tiny cabin, without electricity, without running water, and almost completely disconnected from modern society. For years, the FBI would try to identify him through forensic evidence. But the clue that finally exposed the Unabomber wouldn't come from a bomb. It would come from his own words. By the early 1990s, the Unabomber investigation had already stretched across more than a decade. Federal investigators had examined thousands of pieces of evidence. They had interviewed witnesses, studied mailing patterns, analyzed fragments recovered from crime scenes, and developed psychological profiles of the unknown attacker. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. Who was the Unabomber? Investigators believed they were looking for someone intelligent, someone patient, someone capable of operating independently, and someone willing to wait months or even years between attacks. But the FBI still had no reliable name. Then, after a long period of silence, the attacks resumed. In June 1993, geneticist Charles Epstein was injured by a mailed bomb in California. 2 days later, computer scientist David Galerner received another package at Yale University. He was seriously injured, but survived. The attacks reinforced a pattern investigators had been studying for years: academia, science, technology. The bomber appeared to be targeting people he associated with the technological world he despised. Then, in December 1994, advertising executive Thomas Mosser was killed after receiving a package at his home in New Jersey. Kaczynski later claimed responsibility. His campaign was becoming increasingly deadly. In April 1995, another package killed Gilbert Murray, president of the California Forestry Association. 3 people had now been murdered. Many more had been injured. But investigators still couldn't identify the man responsible. Then, the Unabomber changed his strategy. He began sending letters, not simply devices. The communications revealed something investigators hadn't previously possessed in such detail: his worldview. He condemned industrial society. He attacked modern technology. He argued that technological systems were reducing human freedom, and he presented himself as someone fighting against that system. None of those beliefs justified his violence. But his writings gave investigators something enormously valuable: language. In 1995, Kaczynski sent a lengthy manuscript to major newspapers. It carried the title Industrial Society and Its Future. The document contained roughly 35,000 words. It laid out his arguments against industrialization, technology, modern political movements, and the direction of society. Then came an extraordinary demand. The Unabomber said that, if a major newspaper published his manifesto, he would stop his bombing campaign. Federal authorities now faced an uncomfortable decision: publish the words of a murderer and potentially encourage others, or refuse and risk another attack. After extensive discussion, FBI Director Louis Freeh and Attorney General Janet Reno recommended publication. There was another reason. Someone reading the manifesto might recognize the writing. On September 19, 1995, the Washington Post published the manifesto with assistance from the New York Times. Millions of people could now read the Unabomber's words. Among those readers was a woman named Linda Patrick. Linda was married to David Kaczynski. David had an older brother. His name was Ted. Linda had already wondered whether Ted might somehow be connected to the case. David initially found the possibility difficult to accept. But when they examined the manifesto, certain ideas, expressions, and patterns of language seemed familiar. David remembered letters his brother had written. He began comparing Ted's earlier writings with the published manifesto. The similarities were difficult to ignore. David now faced an extraordinary decision. What if he was wrong? What if he accused his own brother of being one of America's most wanted criminals and destroyed his family? But what if he was right and remained silent? Another person could die. David and Linda eventually contacted an attorney, Tony Bisegli. Through intermediaries, information reached the FBI. Investigators began examining Ted Kaczynski. His background immediately attracted attention. Brilliant mathematician, former university professor, socially isolated, living remotely in Montana. But investigators needed much more than a suspicious biography. They needed evidence. Linguistic specialists compared Ted's known writings with the Manifesto. They examined vocabulary, sentence structure, recurring expressions, unusual phrasing. The similarities strengthened investigators' suspicions. For the first time in nearly 18 years, the FBI had something it had desperately wanted: a serious suspect. His name was Theodore Kaczynski, and he was living almost entirely alone. Inside a small cabin in the Montana wilderness, investigators began watching him, quietly, carefully, from a distance. After years of searching nationwide, the hunt for the Unabomber had finally reached Montana. But before agents could arrest Ted Kaczynski, they needed to know what was inside that cabin. And when they finally entered it, they would find the evidence that ended one of the longest manhunts in FBI history. April 3, 1996. Outside Lincoln, Montana, federal agents approached a small wooden cabin hidden in the wilderness. After nearly 18 years of investigation, authorities believed the man living inside could be the Unabomber. His name was Ted Kaczynski. Agents needed to take him into custody without giving him an opportunity to resist or destroy potential evidence. Using the assistance of a local Forest Service employee, officers drew Kaczynski outside. He was arrested. The nationwide search for the Unabomber had finally reached its end, but the investigation was about to enter its most important phase. Searching the cabin. From the outside, the structure was remarkably simple, roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, no running water, no electricity, few comforts of modern life. Inside, investigators found evidence connecting Kaczynski to the bombing campaign. They recovered extensive handwritten journals, drafts of writings, correspondence, materials connected to the crimes. Investigators also discovered a completed explosive device, which authorities handled as evidence. Perhaps most damaging of all were Kaczynski's own writings. His journals documented his hostility toward technological society and contained admissions connected to the attacks. The man who had spent years trying to avoid identification had preserved a detailed written record of his own thinking. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors charged Kaczynski in connection with the bombing campaign, but as the case moved toward trial, another major legal battle emerged. Kaczynski's mental state became central to the proceedings. His defense attorneys wanted to present evidence concerning his mental health, partly as a strategy to avoid the death penalty. Kaczynski strongly resisted. He did not want his political and technological beliefs dismissed as the product of mental illness. The conflict became so intense that Kaczynski attempted to dismiss his attorneys. He also sought greater control over his own defense. A court-appointed psychiatrist evaluated him and diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. But a psychiatric diagnosis did not erase criminal responsibility. The court ultimately found Kaczynski competent to stand trial. Prosecutors were prepared to seek the death penalty. Then, in January 1998, the case took another turn. Kaczynski agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to federal charges connected to the bombing campaign. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek his execution. Ted Kaczynski was sentenced to life imprisonment. Without the possibility of parole, the Unabomber case was finally over. But one extraordinary detail remained. After one of the largest manhunts in FBI history, after years of forensic examination, thousands of leads, psychological profiles, surveillance, and nationwide searches, the breakthrough had ultimately come from his own family. David Kaczynski recognized similarities between his brother's writings and the Manifesto published nationwide. Reporting his suspicion meant helping authorities build a case against his own brother. But David also understood what silence could mean. Another package. Another victim. Another death. The decision to publish the manifesto had been controversial. Newspapers had effectively given a violent criminal the national audience he demanded. But publication also exposed something Kaczynski couldn't hide. His writing style, his vocabulary, his recurring ideas, his distinctive phrasing. In trying to force America to listen to him, Kaczynski revealed enough of himself for someone close to him to recognize the voice. Kaczynski remained in federal custody for the rest of his life. In June 2023, at the age of 81, Ted Kaczynski was found dead in his cell at a federal medical center in North Carolina. Authorities determined that he died by suicide. Decades after his arrest, the Unabomber case remains one of the FBI's most famous investigations. It is sometimes remembered as a story about a mathematical genius who abandoned modern civilization and declared war on technology. But intelligence does not make violence profound, and ideology does not excuse murder. 3 people were killed, 23 others were injured. Families were permanently changed. And for 17 years, people across the United States received packages without knowing whether one of them might contain something deadly. Kaczynski wanted his manifesto to explain his actions. He wanted society to debate his ideas, and he believed violence could force people to pay attention. But the lasting lesson of the Unabomber case may be something very different. A man spent years hiding from modern society, avoiding many of the technologies investigators normally use to track suspects. He lived in isolation, used no telephone in his cabin, had no electricity there, and operated across enormous distances. Yet eventually, he made one mistake he couldn't undo. He demanded to be heard, and when America finally read his words, one reader recognized them. His own brother. For 17 years, investigators searched for the Unabomber. In the end, the clue that exposed him wasn't hidden inside one of his devices. It was hidden inside the way he wrote.